Hey everyone, what is up? It's me, RealmW, your source for all of your favorite gaming facts, theories, and unsourced 4chan rumors that read like and probably are plagiarized 7th grader fanfiction. Today, we're counting down the top 10 craziest facts about the politics of Pokemon. Before we get into this, I just want to remind you to Falcon Punch that like button. With all that out of the way, let's jump into it. Number 1. Children are allowed to wander around outside, clearly reflective of a society whose laws have completely broken down.
Oh, thank God. Ah!
Anyway, as I was saying, the libertarian paradise depicted in Pokemon Snap is...
Wait, what? Stop! Who are you? What are you even doing here? How did you get into my house?
I'm RealmW. Don't tell me you haven't heard of me. I make videos about dark secrets from everyone's favorite children's media. I heard you were doing a Pokemon video, so I figured I'd stop by to help. But when I got here, you were asleep, so I figured I'd get a rough draft down for you. But enough about me. I'm ready to help you make your video pointing out and overanalyzing crazy details and tiny suspensions of disbelief in children's media.
What? No, why would I want to do that? It's absurd. I'm not even sure I want to do this video anymore.
Isn't that just what you do, though? You can't call what I do absurd when you're the guy who made the politics of Splatoon. Don't tell me with a straight face that somehow doesn't count as overanalyzing. Speaking of, did you know that at night,
Yeah, but that's different. I have a point I'm trying to make with it. I draw conclusions. All you do is present random facts. They're interesting, sure, but there's no end game in saying them. If I do this, I've got to make an actual point about what's depicted in the games, not just an observation.
Yeah, like telling people that some game no one cares about has kinda left-wing politics will ever be useful to literally anyone. Whatever though, man. You won an argument against a straw man you made up. Real well done. Anyway, you do the video or I will, okay?
Hey, you can't just break the fourth wall like that. It's a tired trope. But fine, whatever. I'll make the video. By the way, though, are you me?
In a sense.
Nope, this channel is not about to have internal lore. Get out of my house!
What if I just did a short segment about how isn't it kind of weird that people eat Pokemon stuff?
And give me my keys back. I know that's how you got in here. You aren't magic.
Everyone who voted for this topic in the Twitter poll, my pain is on you.
Hey everyone, Owen here. Just got back from losing half of my audience retention because of the boring skit some idiot put at the front of the video. And today, we're talking about the series that started it all. If by all, we mean the concept of a fan base that despises their own franchise media more than actual haters do, Pokemon. I've been thinking about discussing this series for a while now, but one of the biggest problems with actually doing so has been that it's really difficult to actually pin down a specific topic within it. Sure, I could do the politics of Pokemon or something, but there's simply so much in the series to discuss that it's not really reasonable for one video to cover it all. I could easily fill an entire video with each set of games individually, and I very well may come back to the series in the future. But for today, I wanted to focus very specifically on one common element almost all of Pokemon's entries have between them, the concept of ideology and evil teams. So, Pokemon is, as everyone knows, a game series about being a 10-year-old, running around the country, and using your pets to get into fights with anyone you can make eye contact with. Your main goal in the games is always to qualify to fight and then beat the Pokemon champion of whatever region you might find yourself in, by first challenging and defeating the 8 regional gym leaders. But it's never quite that simple. See, there's always someone who, inadvertently or not, gets in your way, and in almost every game, this someone is an evil team. Everyone's favorite groups of well-dressed evildoers, evil teams are as much a staple of the series as almost any other one of its major elements. They've been present throughout the entirety of the franchise's 20-year history and are a fan-favorite aspect of it. Almost all of the discourse around them has to do with what parts of them Pokemon YouTubers find to be cool, or what their evil team would look like if they started one. And putting away the kind of worrying fact that so many members of the Pokemon community seem pretty ready to join a gang as long as they get to wear fun uniforms, I think that evil teams are actually a relatively untapped source of political analysis, and more important for us today, an incredibly interesting look at how popular media deals with ideology. Before we even get into the topic of the teams themselves, let's talk, to start with, about the ways that Pokemon as a series depicts and interacts with depictions of ideology. Broadly speaking, ideology as a concept is presented in Pokemon as something negative. And to clarify, by ideology, I'm not actually using the word in the way that most academics would probably define it. I'm really referring to anything that differs from the status quo, which is usually viewed as a non-ideology, both within the context of these games and often within culture at large. Anything that falls outside of that norm is always uniquely ideological, but curiously, defense of it, and even its inherently ideological qualities and associated beliefs, is distinct from it. And within Pokemon, ideology is always a force that opposes you, the player, and that you have to fight against to progress. But this struggle is rarely, if ever, depicted as an actual struggle of conflicting ideals or beliefs, but rather an attack by ideology on non-ideology and normality. The player never really fights for anything in particular, and never has any goals they're explicitly seeking an end to. They are only shown to be acting in defense of a vaguely defined good against evil. As much as the player's goals are even referenced, you're fighting for a better world of some sort. But this fight really only ever seems to include the defeat of the evil team and their ideals, and nothing more beyond that. As you've probably guessed, where it happens, the explicit ideology depicted is almost always embodied by evil teams in these games. They are always the ones with the goals and the beliefs. Your only belief, as far as you're told, is that they need to be stopped. And don't get me wrong, stopping the antagonists, the evil teams, is in most cases undeniably a good thing. A fair number of their plans do happen to involve killing, well, kind of everyone. But, as always, it's worth considering why exactly all of these groups are depicted in these ways. Regardless of the completely distinct and unique convictions of each individual team, almost all of them are presented as being puritanical in this way, committed to their beliefs to such an extreme degree that any measures are justified in their realization of it. And I think that the reason for this is that they, and by extension ideology itself, are being set up as antithetical to what is presented as being a natural product of non-ideology and the status quo. That is to say, peace and order are directly tied to the status quo, which itself is tied to non-ideology. Since ideology is inherently antagonistic towards non-ideology, it's naturally also antagonistic to the states of being that proponents of the status quo believe are inextricably linked to it. If you believe that non-ideology is naturally peaceful, then in your eyes, regardless of how true that belief may actually be, ideology threatens that peace. To you, ideology is inherently violent. But, of course, that's an absurd belief, not least because non-ideology isn't even a real thing. The status quo of today, politically, economically, and socially, is itself incredibly violent towards vast swaths of the world's population, and it itself is very much ideological. The status quo is just whatever set of beliefs and systems have come to be broadly accepted at any given time, but that acceptance doesn't make it anything other than just beliefs. The ideals and values of many evil teams are often very interesting, some of them may even make a lot of sense, but when these ideas are tainted by the violence of their execution, they're never re-examined because the games don't really view the ideas and violence as ever separate. This manner of dealing with ideology can actually be seen clearly in a lot of popular media today, notably the seemingly never-ending flood of superhero content, particularly that coming from Marvel, where ideologies that the media views as problematic are often attached to senseless violence, often with little clear correlation between that violence and the tenets of the ideology, as a way to diminish its legitimacy. And in Marvel's case, considering how they depict the United States and specifically the United States military, it's not a coincidence that many of these ideologies are aesthetically reminiscent of leftist movements. Sometimes violence works in this way in Pokemon 2 to invalidate a specific ideology, and we'll get to that, but it's also used to condemn the concept of ideology itself. However, it's kind of an artificial removal of legitimacy because all that's happening is that violence is added on to beliefs. And that's not to say that violent ideologies don't exist, they obviously do. Fascism, for instance, inherently involves violent solutions to the existence of its undesirable groups, and even things like neoliberalism include as a part of them an acceptance of the existence of certain kinds of structural violence, notably against the poor. But oftentimes these beliefs aren't that, and aren't demonstrated to be that. They're just ideologies that have violence used to realize them. For the most part, nothing about their ideals fundamentally necessitate or involve violence. Obviously though, this doesn't necessarily apply when it comes to the villains of the first two sets of Pokemon games, Red and Blue, or Green in Japan, and Gold and Silver in Team Rocket. Everyone's kind of familiar with these guys, Jesse and James, who are kind of the face of the group because of their appearance in the anime. Their whole thing is just kind of comical schemes to steal Pikachu for vague reasons, but in the games, Team Rocket is an actual criminal organization doing criminal organization kinds of things, and unfortunately they don't include these two bisexual icons. Their main things are reselling stolen goods and trading black market items, kidnapping Pokemon, hostage situations, other kinds of petty burglary, and of course the most vile crime of all, violation of copyright law. Their motto is literally steal Pokemon for profit, exploit Pokemon for profit, all Pokemon exist for the glory of Team Rocket, which first of all would make a great wall hanging, and second of all clearly isn't an especially nuanced position. It's kind of just a long way of saying evil is cool, which I mean, yeah, fair enough, you know, the villains are always sexier. But there's not really much actual ideology there. However, all of that changes with Generation 3, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, and the two teams from those titles, Team Magma and Team Aqua. These two groups are actually in conflict with each other, having opposite goals. Team Magma wants to expand the world's land masses in order to provide more room for specifically human civilization to expand, and Team Aqua wants to expand the seas to wipe out human civilization and provide more room for Pokemon to live. A variety of crimes can be attributed to both groups, but all of them are relatively minor compared to what those crimes are in service of, which is ultimately the awakening of one of the game's primal Pokemon, Groudon or Kyogre, to realize their goals. Groudon, of course, to expand the continents, and Kyogre to expand the sea. And at the game's narrative climax, one of the teams, depending on which version of the game you play, actually succeeds in this goal, awakening the Pokemon and beginning the completion of their vision. But soon after, they come to the realization that they were wrong, and that they won't be able to control the Pokemon they've unleashed. Almost immediately feeling regret for this, the team leaders help the player character to prevent the near total destruction of the world resulting from their actions. So, I mean, the lesson here makes sense, right? The groups had extreme beliefs, they tried to realize them, and then suffered the unforeseen consequences of their actions. But actually, if you're a fan of the Pokemon games, you might be rushing to the comments to correct me here, because actually those are only the motivations of the evil teams in the remakes of those games, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. In the original games, their ideals are much more, well, tame to say the least. The team's goals are much more limited, being an expansion of the seas to provide more habitats for water Pokemon, or an expansion of the land to provide more room for humans and Pokemon to coexist, but not the elimination of the other side. However, regardless of those differences, the game's climax is roughly identical between the original titles and the remakes, in that the situation spirals wildly out of control to the point of imminent and broad destruction of the world. Regardless of the substantial changes in motivations and goals between the games, both narratives essentially consider the evil teams to be equally bad through the outcome it depicts for them. The games depict the world as being a perfectly balanced system, and suggest that attempting to alter that balance can only end in calamity. And most notably, this balance is with relation to human and Pokemon interaction and coexistence, an idea that the games grapple with a lot and which we'll discuss a lot throughout this video as a result. In the remake titles, both Team Magma and Team Aqua want to reject the coexistence of people and Pokemon in opposite ways, which leads to them coming into conflict with each other, believing that Pokemon should be essentially eliminated or that humans should, respectively. As the leader of Team Magma says,
"This foolish world has held back humanity's progress out of misguided idealism regarding the coexistence of humans and Pokemon."
Which stands in contrast to the opinion of his Team Aqua counterpart, being that
we humans have disregarded Pokemon and nature both in our endless pursuit of our own desires and needs. And in this process, we've created this broken and disordered world.
In the originals, however, while both teams still in a sense reject coexistence, they don't so much reject it as a concept, both wanting to keep both sides intact, but rather reject the idea that it's presently a balanced coexistence, believing it needs corrected. But as we know, both of those concepts are rejected by the narrative of the games, which maintain that the balance that exists must be maintained at all costs. This is very much like our earlier idea of attaching violence to an ideology in order to dismiss it, just here it's the act of prescribing an inevitable outcome so damning to both extreme and relatively moderate expressions of the same ideology that it completely dismisses any consideration of their underlying ideas. The game ultimately tries to make a point about balance in a world that is consistently and demonstrably not balanced, and which constantly skews towards human domination over Pokemon and the environment. We see regularly throughout the games that a sustainable balance does not exist in a meaningful way, with Pokemon actively going extinct, being displaced by human habitat destruction, or being exploited by humans. So the games making the assertion that the balance between humans and Pokemon needs to exist isn't itself necessarily a problematic statement. The Team Magma and Team Aqua of the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald would probably even agree with it. But it's a weird centrist position in that it acts like the middle of the issue where that balance can be found is already present when it isn't. This ties back into our earlier discussion of why ideologies as a concept might be portrayed as inherently harmful, because they are inherently dangerous to the status quo. It doesn't particularly matter that the Team Magma and Team Aqua of the original games are vastly different in actual beliefs to their counterparts in the remakes. They're given the same outcome and by extension condemnation because they both pose the same amount of threat to that status quo. And as the player here, your only real goal is to put a stop to the schemes of both teams. You don't really have any actual individual ideas about what the world should look like beyond the present situation, only a conception of what it shouldn't look like. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that the beliefs or actions of either team in the remakes or even necessarily the original titles were right. In at least Team Magma's case, if you ever have a goal that can be effectively paraphrased as "we need more Lebensraum," that's a pretty big red flag. But the game's depictions of these groups raises questions when they're the only groups presented as explicitly ideological and are intentionally portrayed in a way that seems to condemn ideology itself, regardless of severity, as a protection of the status quo. The next Pokemon generation, Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, only feature one evil team between them in Team Galactic. Now, like every other team we've discussed up to this point, Team Galactic does engage in a variety of relatively petty crimes in order to achieve their goals. But actually this time, I'm not super interested in that, and instead I want to talk specifically about what their ideology is and what its implications are. Team Galactic's main goal is actually roughly similar to that of the remake versions of Team Magma and Team Aqua. They want to do away with the universe as it is and start over, in this case with the specific stipulation that their leader, Cyrus, become god of that new world. However, their reasoning for this is a bit different, with their main goal being the end of conflict between people and believing that this can only be achieved by this new world removing human spirit. They hold that the weaknesses in human spirits are the source of conflict, and so if conflict is to be avoided, the spirit itself can't exist. Interestingly, this implies that to them, the idea of a perfect human spirit is unachievable even in a perfect world, so the only realistic goal is its removal. Depending on how you read it, that can either be taken as hypocritical since they still view their own judgment with human spirits as being sound, or strangely grounded, realizing that some outcomes, even in seemingly perfect scenarios, are unrealistic to expect. Take your pick. But I think that, as always, the most interesting points come in the way that the game tries to more directly present and explain them to the audience. Nearing the end of the games in Diamond and Pearl, after Cyrus has been defeated by the player, he leaves control of Team Galactic to his subordinate, Saturn. When this happens, she appears to have a bit of a change of heart, telling the player that
Cyrus' confident manner of speaking, his logical words. I think people just became so enthralled by him. I allowed myself to believe his words because I wanted to see the world he intended to make. I've been left in charge of this HQ building and the remnants of the membership. The decision on what Team Galactic should do rests with me, but I've learned extremism is never the solution.
So this is a bit weird, particularly that last bit. Now, most of this quote as I read it is actually pretty much just a condemnation of blindly following charismatic leaders, not really something I think most people would have any reason to argue with. But that last bit, I've learned that extremism is never the solution, raises a question. What is then? Because on its face, that seems like a pretty innocuous thing to say, just like, yeah, murdering everyone outright might not be a great idea after all. But the game sort of takes this point and uses it to hand-wave away any actual discussion of what Team Galactic's goals are and whether they're worth pursuing in some way. Saying that extremism isn't the solution implies that there's something more moderate that is, but what that is never actually of any particular concern to the games. It's a gesture towards thinking about the ideas presented by the team without actually taking the time to do so. While this dialogue is actually a bit longer in Platinum version, with Saturn saying,
But I've learned that extremism is never the solution. Perhaps we should really be searching for new sources of energy instead of lying about it through our commercials.
This elaboration still doesn't really do anything to examine her or Team Galactic's beliefs, because creating or gaining energy was never their main goal. It was always just something that only served to realize their broader goal of a world without conflict. And in games who feature conflict as such a central theme and aspect of the world, it's very odd that you would so completely ignore addressing this. Given that there's no non-extreme way to improve this situation that's presented, and considering the similar idea in Ruby and Sapphire that the status quo can't be deviated from in any way, it's kind of, if unintentionally, implied that Team Galactic is almost correct in trying to start a new world, because their ideology, even if it were more moderate, of altering the way things are, is incompatible with the world that already exists. Pokemon Black, White, and their direct sequels are actually an even more direct example of this general avoidance of actually engaging with the ideology of the game's villains in favor of dismissing what are in large part unavoidably true observations about the world of the games through associating it with violence. The evil team in question here is Team Plasma, who believes that Pokemon are being exploited by people and that the relationship between Pokemon and humans is imbalanced in favor of humans, and whose goal is to liberate Pokemon from trainers who ostensibly own them, and to separate people from Pokemon. Much of this liberation is done through the forceful removal of Pokemon from their trainers, and through acts of terrorism. As the king of Team Plasma, N, tells the player,
Many different values mix together and the world becomes gray. That is unforgivable. I will separate Pokemon and people, and Black and White will be clearly distinct.
And this quote actually represents an odd idea that the game wants us to associate with N and his team, being that their position is one that is in conflict with nuance in the existence of conflicting ideas or values. Which is, well, kind of rich coming from a series that basically tries to tell you that if you ever try to make a minor alteration to your situation, there's a fair chance that everyone will die. And even these initial goals that Team Plasma has ultimately give away to self-justifying pursuit of power, with the real mastermind of the movement, Getsis, taking control of power for himself alone. Even with N though, it's kind of implied that the only way people could come to agree with Team Plasma, or at least the only way that N sees that happening, is through forcing them to. As he says,
Right now, my friends aren't strong enough to save all Pokemon. Maybe I can't solve the equation that will change the world. So I need power. Power enough to make anyone agree with me.
But even with all of that, Black and White actually does do the most of any Pokemon game to cast its villainous team in a more nuanced light. For one, showing that the team fell to these bids for power is almost a sympathetic view to their beliefs, since it implies that that wasn't an inherent part of them, though it does happen to carry with it the less than ideal connotations that such social movements seeking any kind of liberation or challenges to the status quo will inevitably be co-opted or collapse in on themselves. Pokemon liberation is good in theory but will never work in practice, right? And much like Diamond and Pearl, Black and White 2 actually do depict a way in which N and Team Plasma's philosophies could be, in the eyes of the game, responsibly carried out and realized. After they were defeated by the player character at the end of the original games, Team Plasma actually divides into two groups, one closer to the power-hungry nature of the original team, and one loyal to N with a much softer philosophy and a focus on helping Pokemon separated from their trainers. And hey, it looks like they actually addressed my biggest problem with Diamond and Pearl by actually showing a successful version of the group's underlying philosophy divorced from the violence. And I do appreciate the fact that they're at least able to do that removal of the violence. But like my issue with the previous generation, this isn't really the same philosophy, or at least it doesn't address the same issues. The Team Plasma loyal to N still has the goal of helping Pokemon, sure, but it also has pretty much abandoned any attempt to address human-Pokemon interaction and helping Pokemon through that, not even moving to something more moderate than complete liberation and instead leaving the issue behind altogether. So the game isn't really saying that there's a less radical way to tackle the issue of human-Pokemon relationships, it's saying that there's a less radical issue to worry about. And that doesn't mean that what N is doing now isn't meaningful, but it isn't really consistent with what his original goals were. Like last time, the game gets to gesture towards there being a way to do what Team Plasma wanted peacefully, while still getting to avoid the actual center of what their goals were by focusing on an issue which was related to those original goals, but very much not equivalent. Pokemon X and Y could really be considered the last games with a real evil team, at least in the traditional sense. Both generations of games that followed it, Sun, Moon, Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon, and Sword and Shield, while having villainous characters, relegate their teams to being relatively non-ideological troublemakers, posing pretty much no serious threat in the long term, and often being played for comic relief. X and Y's evil team is called Team Flare, and they're led by this dude, Lysander. Their deal is that, shocker, they want to destroy the world, but in their case the motivations are a lot more vague, being to create some eternal beauty to preempt society going downhill and destroying it. Fundamentally, Team Flare is a reactionary group against what they see as a societal downward trend, and want to prevent that trend from being played out further by cutting civilization short. It's a little bit fascist, but instead of believing that they can somehow go back to a previous better time, they just think that they need to stop it now before it gets any worse. As Lysander himself describes his reasoning,
if cooperation to bring about a better world were possible, all wars would have ended years ago. I can only see one future, one where selfish, foolish humans think of nothing other than themselves and steal more and more from one another. It's a tragic future.
And to not beat around the bush too much, they are one of the most easy groups in the series to condemn. I already compared them to fascists. Their goals are vague, their ideology is again reactionary, and their methods are extreme and violent. But I don't think the interesting aspects of Team Flare lie so much in them in isolation, but in comparing them in their treatment to other groups in Pokemon. I joked about this when I mentioned it, and we discussed this a little bit at the beginning of the video, but it's not an insignificant detail that Team Flare, much like several other evil teams we've discussed, seeks to destroy the world and build a new one in its place. And it might seem a bit odd, or perhaps just representative of rather lazy world building of antagonists, that all of these vastly different groups with much different goals ultimately use such similar methods to carry out those goals. But if we think back to our conclusions with discussing Team Galactic, I think it might actually make a lot of sense. See, with that team, I made the assertion that the game implies that the belief in a better world that Team Galactic holds is incompatible with the world itself of that game. And even earlier than that, when talking about Team Magma and Team Aqua, we touched on the idea that in Pokemon, the status quo is an irremovable and unchangeable aspect of the world. And hopefully now it's coming together a bit. As I hinted at earlier, all of these groups that do so are using the same violent philosophy of cleansing the world because they are all equally violent to the status quo in deviating from it, and in the world Pokemon presents, the only way to challenge the status quo is fundamentally to challenge the world and even the universe that enforce it. At the end of videos, I always have something that I want to make very clear, and at the end of this video, I want to make very clear that there is nothing wrong with condemning harmful ideologies in media, or even necessarily depicting ideologies in a somewhat exaggerated manner to make a point. I think I kind of did that way at the beginning of this video in my skit. But when consuming this media, it's important to think about how it interacts with and depicts those ideologies, both on an individual basis and the concept as a whole, and how it relates those to and thinks about the status quo. And let's be perfectly honest with ourselves. All of this stuff is a relatively minor aspect of these games. It's good against evil plots, like duh, it's not gonna have a super nuanced analysis of its villains. But I think that it raises a lot of questions. These are called villainous teams. It's clear what we're meant to think about them. And when these teams are the only ones who believe anything or are fighting for something, I don't think it's unreasonable to think about the implications of that.
I don't know if you guys can hear this, but there's some fucking bells going off.
Yeah, it's 5:01 now. It's 5:01 now. We're done. We're done. You can stop.